The blade rose, but mercy never fell. In the courtyard of the Tower of London, on a spring morning in 1541, an old woman was dragged before a restless crowd. She was no ordinary prisoner. Her name was Margaret Pole, and at nearly 70 years of age she stood as one of the last living links to the mighty house of Plantagenet. The air was sharp with dread. The murmurs among the spectators carried a single truth that made the scene heavier than iron. England was about to kill its own past. The executioner, young and visibly unskilled, trembled as he raised his axe. Margaret refused to kneel. Her voice cut through the silence, trembling yet defiant. "I am no traitor. I die a daughter of York." The first swing missed its mark, slicing her shoulder instead of her neck. Blood sprayed across the scaffold, and a scream tore from her throat. The crowd recoiled in horror. Some covered their faces, others whispered in disbelief, as if they had just witnessed sacrilege. Again and again the axe came down, hacking at her body in a frenzy that turned the solemn ritual of justice into a spectacle of butchery. It took 10 blows before her head finally fell. That day, the tower's stones were not just stained with blood, but with shame. For this was not merely the death of a woman, it was the symbolic murder of a dynasty. Why did Henry VIII order such savagery against a grandmother who posed no threat with sword or army? Why did Europe denounce this execution as a crime against God himself? Stay with us until the very end, as we uncover the secrets, betrayals, and terrors behind the brutal execution of Margaret Pole, the Last Plantagenet. And if you wish to join us on this journey into the darkest corners of history, make sure to subscribe so you never miss the next tale of power and blood. Blood was destiny in medieval England, and Margaret Pole carried blood that kings both revered and feared. Born in 1473, she was the daughter of George, Duke of Clarence, brother to 2 kings, Edward IV and Richard III. Her very veins were threaded with Plantagenet lineage, and in an age when bloodline was power, that made her both precious and dangerous. Her childhood was steeped in turbulence. She was only a girl when her father, accused of treason, was drowned in a barrel of wine in the Tower. The shadow of betrayal marked her life before she could understand its meaning. Her uncle Edward IV was dead. Her cousins, the princes in the Tower, vanished without explanation. The dynasty that had ruled for centuries was collapsing in whispers and blood. When the Tudors seized the throne in 1485, victory at Bosworth did more than crown Henry VII. It transformed the surviving children of York into living threats. Margaret Pole, though young, was seen not as an innocent woman, but as a vessel of rival legitimacy. Every time a courtier glanced at her, they saw not a widow or mother, but the echo of York's claim to England's crown. Henry VII understood this well. Though he arranged her marriage into relative obscurity, he kept her under careful watch. For even without armies, a woman like Margaret could still become a banner. In the murmur of taverns, in the dreams of discontented nobles, one phrase endured: as long as she lives, the shadow of York lives with her. The Plantagenet bloodline was more than history. It was a memory of kings who had ruled with iron for 3 centuries. Henry VII's victory could not erase that memory, nor could the birth of his son, the future Henry VIII. And so Margaret existed as a paradox. At times, she was respected, even restored to titles and lands. She was granted the earldom of Salisbury, rare for a woman, and for a while lived in dignity. Yet beneath the courtly surface lay suspicion as sharp as any blade. Henry VIII, more volatile than his father, inherited this fear. He saw Margaret not only as the daughter of Clarence, but as the living reminder of dynasties he had crushed to rule. He called her Lady Salisbury, but he watched her as though she were a flame near dry straw. His counselors whispered to him, "The crown is never safe while the blood of York still breathes." Margaret's presence was like an unspoken threat hanging over the Tudor court. Even when she meant no rebellion, her silence was treated as resistance, her loyalty as conditional. The Tudor dynasty was new, fragile, desperate to prove itself eternal. And what better symbol of its fragility than an old woman whose ancestry could summon ghosts more powerful than armies? This was the curse of Margaret Pole's birth. She had not sought ambition, yet ambition was thrust upon her by blood. She had not sought power, yet power clung to her name. And so, from the moment the Tudors rose, she became not just a noblewoman, but a reminder of a dynasty destroyed, a candle that would not go out. For Henry VIII, that candle could not be allowed to burn forever. If Margaret's blood made her dangerous, her loyalty made her unforgettable. In the glittering but treacherous world of Henry VIII's court, alliances were as vital as armies. Margaret chose hers carefully, and she chose them with her heart. That choice would seal her fate. When Catherine of Aragon arrived in England as the bride of Prince Arthur, Margaret was among the noblewomen who welcomed her. Years later, when Catherine became queen to Henry VIII, the bond between the two women grew deeper than ceremony. Catherine, devout and proud, found in Margaret a mirror of steadfastness. They were both women shaped by dynasties, both exiled in spirit, both carrying the weight of a crown's cruelty. Margaret was entrusted with the care of Catherine's only surviving child, Princess Mary. In the quiet chambers of the palace, it was Margaret who whispered prayers over the cradle. Margaret, who guided the girl's steps. Margaret, who kept the memory of Catherine's dignity alive in her daughter. To Mary, Margaret was not just a governess. She was a shield, a second mother. But in the court of Henry VIII, loyalty to Catherine meant defiance to the king. When Henry's passion for Anne Boleyn ignited, when he sought to annul his marriage to Catherine and defy the Pope, most nobles bent like reeds in a storm. They called Anne queen with forced smiles, desperate to survive. Margaret did not. One evening, as torches flickered against the stone walls, Catherine reached for Margaret's hand. Her eyes, weary from endless trials, shone with a quiet fire. "Your loyalty may cost you your life," Catherine whispered, her voice trembling with both gratitude and warning. "But it will save your soul." Margaret squeezed her hand, her reply steady as iron. "Then I choose the soul, not the throne." Those words spread like sparks through the court. Servants repeated them in hushed tones. Courtiers whispered. Margaret bows to Catherine, but never to Anne. With each whisper, Margaret's defiance grew larger than herself. She became a silent banner, not of rebellion with swords, but of rebellion in spirit. Henry heard the rumors. At first, he dismissed them as the stubbornness of an old woman. Yet the more Anne Boleyn demanded recognition, the more Margaret's refusal stung. Anne saw her as a thorn, a relic of York who would not bend to Tudor will. In her pride, Anne fumed. In his anger, Henry brooded. And in Margaret's silence, danger deepened. At feasts, Margaret sat with calm composure, acknowledging Catherine with gentle courtesy. while offering Anne nothing more than a cool glance. No speeches, no open challenge. But in a court where silence was louder than any shout, her restraint was damning. To the king, this was not merely personal disobedience, it was political defiance. If Margaret, with her Plantagenet blood and her unyielding dignity, would not accept Anne, then others might refuse as well. And if others refused, Henry's new order could fracture. Margaret had become more than a grandmother, more than a countess, more than a friend. She had become a symbol of Catherine's honor, of Mary's legitimacy, and of everything Henry wished to erase. And symbols, Henry knew, were more dangerous than armies. When Catherine of Aragon was cast aside, Margaret Pole found herself drifting into silence. The court that once respected her turned cold. No honors, no invitations, no place at the side of the new queen. She was not formally disgraced, yet her dignity was treated as a threat. The corridors that had echoed with her counsel now seemed to close against her. Still, one bond remained. Princess Mary, Catherine's daughter, clung to Margaret as a guardian figure. The girl had been declared illegitimate, her status reduced to that of a servant in her father's own court. To Mary, the loss of her mother's crown was unbearable. But the presence of Margaret was a faint light in the darkness, in secret glances and stolen words. Mary drew strength from the woman who had never bowed to Anne. One evening, as dusk fell over the palace gardens, Mary whispered to her, "They may strip me of my name, but they cannot strip me of your love." Margaret touched her cheek gently, replying, "Your mother's truth lives in you. Hold fast, child. Crowns may fall, but honor does not." Those words bound them in a silence heavier than steel. Henry VIII could tolerate many things, but not symbols of defiance. Mary herself was already dangerous in his eyes, a daughter who might one day rally the people. That Margaret remained by her side, embodying Catherine's lost dignity, made her more dangerous still. And yet the true storm came not from Margaret's chamber, nor from Mary's sorrow, but from a voice that echoed across seas. Her son, Reginald Pole, had fled to Italy, where the fires of scholarship and faith burned brightly. He was no warrior, yet his pen struck harder than any sword. When Henry tore England from the Pope, declaring himself head of the Church, Reginald's fury erupted. He did not write with caution. He wrote with the conviction of a prophet. His treatise condemned Henry as a false king, a man who sacrificed his people's souls to feed his lust. The words spread across Europe, carried by bishops, debated by scholars, praised by Rome. In Whitehall, the book was read aloud to the king, each sentence struck like a blade. "England bleeds because of one man's pride," Reginald wrote, "and her crown has become a tyrant's mask." Henry's hand crashed onto the table, goblets shaking, courtiers frozen. His roar filled the chamber. "My subject dares call me Pharaoh, then his mother will pay his debt." The words silenced all around him, but not Thomas Cromwell. Cold, deliberate, he stepped forward and murmured, "Mercy to her is treason to you. Sire, strike the root, and no branch will ever rise again." Henry turned his gaze to the fire. For a moment, perhaps, doubt flickered. Margaret was old, unarmed, her life nearly spent, yet she was still Plantagenet. still the mother of the man who had cursed him before Christendom. Her survival was a living reminder that his throne stood on fragile soil. The decision was swift, though unspoken. From that night, Margaret was no longer a noblewoman in quiet exile. She was an enemy, not for what she had done, but for the words her son had carved into Europe's conscience. The curse of her blood had awakened again. The order was given in silence, but the footsteps that followed thundered through Margaret's life. Soldiers arrived at her estates without warning, their armor glinting in the gray morning. No summons to court, no trial to face her peers, only the cold command of the king. The Countess of Salisbury, nearly 70 years old, was taken from her home and carried toward the Tower of London. The journey was long and humiliating. Once she had traveled with retinues and banners, now she was escorted like a criminal, her possessions stripped away, her household scattered. When they reached the looming gates of the tower, she lifted her head, refusing to weep. She had been here before as a child, when her father had met his end in these same walls. History, it seemed, had circled back to claim her. Her cell was damp, narrow, and cold. Stones wept with moisture, and the air smelled of decay. Yet Margaret endured with the dignity that had marked her life. Each morning she clutched her rosary, whispering prayers until her fingers bled from the pressure of the beads. Servants who brought her food whispered of her composure, how she carried herself not as a prisoner, but as if she were still seated in her own hall. One gaoler, hardened by years of cruelty, was struck by her bearing. "My lady," he muttered through the bars one evening, "you stand taller in chains than many do in freedom." Margaret's eyes lifted from her prayers. "Chains are only iron," she replied. "Shame belongs to those who forge them, not to those who wear them." Outside the tower, whispers spread. Princess Mary, now reduced to the shadows of court, had not forgotten her old guardian, though she dared not speak too loudly. She confided in a trusted maid, "If they have locked away Lady Salisbury, then they have locked away my last protector. To strike her is to strike my mother's memory, and mine as well." Meanwhile, within the royal council, Margaret's imprisonment became a warning. Courtiers glanced at one another in fear. If the king could drag the last Plantagenet into the tower without trial, then no title, no loyalty, no age could shield them. Even in silence, Margaret unsettled the throne. Nights in her cell stretched endlessly. Sometimes she thought of her children, scattered and hunted. Sometimes she thought of Reginald, far away in Italy, whose words had brought this doom upon her. Yet she did not curse him. To another maid she whispered softly, "A son must speak the truth he sees, even if the price is his mother's blood. Let mine be the offering, if it guards his soul." The girl knelt, tears staining her apron. "But my lady, do you not fear death?" Margaret smiled faintly, her face etched with lines of both sorrow and serenity. "I fear no death. I fear only forgetting who I am." In that moment, the tower seemed less a prison than a stage where dignity defied power. To some, she was a relic of York. To others, she was a martyr in waiting. To Henry, she was a problem still unsolved. And so she waited, her life suspended between prayer and sentence, between silence and the axe. The tower walls, heavy with centuries of secrets, had witnessed countless tragedies. Soon, they would witness hers. The morning of May 27, 1541, dawned cold over the Tower of London. Mist clung to the stones, heavy as if the fortress itself mourned what was about to unfold. Guards came to Margaret's cell. Their faces were pale, their silence louder than chains. The 70-year-old woman rose without faltering. Her rosary hung from her wrist, worn thin by endless prayer. She asked no questions, for she already knew the answer. With measured steps, she followed them through the narrow passages, past the damp walls that had swallowed so many lives before hers. When the courtyard opened before her, the crowd fell into an uneasy hush. Nobles pressed close to watch. Commoners stood on tiptoe, all drawn to the morbid spectacle. At the center stood the scaffold, stark against the gray sky, its timbers already darkened by the blood of others. But today was different. Today, history itself was being executed. Margaret climbed the steps slowly, her back straight, her face unbowed. She did not look at the crowd. She looked upward, toward a sky that seemed to deny the sun. The executioner awaited her, a youth barely trained, his hands trembling as he gripped the axe. The charges were read, hollow words that dissolved into the wind. When the herald's voice fell silent, Margaret spoke only once, her voice firm despite her years. "I am no traitor," she declared, "but a true daughter of York." The words lingered in the air, heavy as iron. The executioner lifted his weapon. His arms shook, his breath ragged. The first stroke missed its mark. The axe tore into her shoulder, and a gasp surged through the crowd. Margaret cried out in pain, staggering but refusing to collapse. Blood spread across her gown, dark and shocking against the pale fabric. He struck again, and again. Panic drove him, not skill. Each blow fell cruelly, without precision, hacking at flesh rather than ending life. The crowd recoiled, horrified. Some turned their faces away, others clutched at their mouths. The solemn ritual of execution had descended into slaughter. By the time the final blow fell, silence gripped the courtyard. It was not the silence of respect, but of horror. An old woman had been butchered on the king's command, and England itself seemed stained by the act. A witness murmured under his breath, words that carried in the stillness. This was not justice. This was murder. The tower's stones drank her blood, but could not contain the shock. Within days, word raced across Europe. In Paris, whispers told of a queenly figure struck down like cattle. In Rome, priests denounced the act as a crime against God. In Spain, courtiers shook their heads in disbelief that a king would so dishonor his own crown. England had silenced a woman, but in doing so, it had given her voice to the world. The death of Margaret Pole did not fade quietly into history. It echoed like a wound across kingdoms, each whisper of her execution staining Henry VIII's crown. In Rome, the Pope called it a crime against God himself. To strike down an aged woman without trial was not only an act of cruelty, but of sacrilege. In the courts of Europe, ambassadors spoke of England not with awe, but with revulsion. For the people of England, her death became a symbol. She was the last true Plantagenet, the final living branch of a dynasty that had ruled for 300 years. With her blood, that lineage was severed. In villages and taverns, her name was spoken with sorrow. Some said she died more queenly in chains than Anne Boleyn ever did in a crown. Others swore they had seen the axe miss again and again in their dreams, a vision too gruesome to forget. Her son Reginald, far away in Italy, received the news with devastation. He had raised his voice against tyranny, but the price was his mother's life. Witnesses described him falling to his knees, whispering that he would never forgive Henry for him. Her death was not only personal tragedy, it was proof that the Tudors ruled through fear, not through justice. The image of her end lingered as a warning. Dynasties built on blood cannot escape blood. If a king must butcher a grandmother to secure his throne, what stability could that throne ever claim? Margaret's fall revealed the heart of Tudor power, dazzling on the surface, but corroded within. Her body was laid in the earth of the tower, unmarked and unhonored. But her story refused to die. She became a ghost in the chronicles of England, a reminder that crowns gleam only when history chooses to forget the screams beneath them. The Plantagenets were gone, yet in her martyrdom they lived on, haunting the dynasty that replaced them. And so the scaffold of 1541 speaks still. It asks us to consider the cost of power, the silence of justice, and the cruelty of fear. Margaret Pole's blood was spilled to protect a throne, but in truth, it exposed the throne's weakness. If you have followed her story until this final moment, then you have walked through one of the darkest corridors of royal history. But there are more corridors, more rulers who bathed their crowns in blood, more secrets hidden behind palace walls. Stay with us as we uncover those forgotten voices. And if you wish to walk with us into these shadows, make sure to like this video, share it with others who seek the truth, and subscribe to this channel. For here, history does not sleep. Here, the dead still speak.